The company I built survived my husband. My name almost didn't. In my first life, I fought Nolan for control of Cedar Row until our responsibilities became impossible to separate. When the company finally collapsed, his reports carried my signatures, his failed orders carried my approvals, and he told the board he had inherited a disaster I created. I died years later, with that version still attached to me. Then I opened my eyes at the board meeting where everything had begun. Nolan was asking for full executive control. In my first life, I said no. This time, I slid the transfer papers toward him. "You want the company? Run it." His smile came too quickly. Before leaving, I gave the board secretary one sealed envelope. Nolan laughed. "A farewell speech? Not for you." I wrote one sentence across the front. "Open at the first independent audit." Then I handed my husband exactly what he had spent years claiming he could manage without me. In my first life, I thought fighting Nolan meant protecting Cedar Row. I had built the company from a rented workshop with 6 employees and 1 battered delivery truck. By the time Nolan joined me, we had 2 plants, hotel contracts across 3 states, and customers willing to wait months because they trusted our work. Nolan hated the waiting. "We're turning away growth because you're afraid of pressure," he told me. "I'm afraid of promising what the factory can't build. That is why companies scale." At first, I fought every decision. Then the board started calling me controlling. Nolan was charming with clients. He could walk into a room with 1 sample chair and leave with an order for 300. I was the person who had to figure out how to make 300 chairs exist. When he won more authority, I stayed. That was my mistake. He signed a resort project our main plant could not finish on time. I called an old supplier and secured extra material. He promised a restaurant chain custom tables without checking the finishing schedule. I moved crews to nights. He delayed maintenance on a cutting machine because stopping production would make his quarterly numbers look worse. When the machine failed, I rented equipment and kept the line moving. Every rescue taught him the same lesson. Rachel would fix it. Then Marcus Vale joined finance. He spoke in smooth phrases about modernization, efficiency, and cleaning up legacy reporting. When production fell behind, Marcus suggested recording some orders as substantially complete because most of the material had already been purchased. I refused at first. Then payroll came due. A client threatened to cancel. Nolan stood in my office and said, "Do you want to be right, or do you want 600 people paid?" I approved a corrective schedule, not fraud, not theft, just another compromise made under pressure. Soon, Cedar Row began buying through North Crest sourcing. The wood arrived late. Some batches warped during finishing. Hardware failed inspection. Nolan blamed the plant. Marcus blamed the old supplier system. I used our reserves to replace rejected material. I signed emergency purchases. I called furious clients myself. I stopped asking who had caused each problem because I was too busy keeping the next one from becoming visible. A year later, the company was bleeding cash. Warehouse counts did not match finance reports. Returned furniture filled half a loading bay. 3 major clients were threatening to leave. Then Nolan called an emergency board meeting. Marcus presented the numbers. My signatures appeared on corrective orders, supplier approvals, production changes, and emergency spending. Nolan sat across from me and said quietly, I tried to fix the company Rachel built. I stared at him. You created these problems. He did not deny it. He simply turned to the board. Then why did she approve every solution? That question destroyed me, because the answer was everywhere. I had spent a year making sure his failures could not be seen. And when Cedar Row finally broke, the only fingerprints left on the repairs were mine. The conference room came back before I understood why. Oak table, quarterly reports, Nolan sitting across from me, with one hand resting on the transfer packet. For several seconds, I could still feel the weight of the life I had already lost. Then I saw the date printed at the top of the agenda. March 14th, the meeting where Nolan first demanded full executive control. In my first life, I fought him for nearly 4 months. 4 months of split authority. 4 months of shared approvals. 4 months in which every mistake became impossible to assign cleanly. This time, I knew exactly what that confusion would cost me. The board chair cleared his throat. Rachel, Nolan is proposing a 12-month executive transition. He would oversee sales, procurement, operations, and finance. Nolan leaned forward. You would remain founder and owner. I'm asking you to stop blocking growth. In my first life, I had argued until my voice shook. This time, I opened the transfer packet. Nolan watched me carefully. You're reading it. I'm checking the effective time. His expression changed. Why? Because if you want control, you should have control. I signed the authorization. Not blindly. I wrote the exact effective date and requested that the board record the hour. Then I turned to the secretary. I want a complete handover inventory before the transfer becomes active tomorrow at noon. Nolan smiled. You think I need training wheels? No. I looked at the production report beside him. I think every company deserves to know where one management period ends and the next one begins. 22 hours remained before Cedar Row became his responsibility. This time, I intended to leave the line impossible to blur. At 11:50 the next morning, the board reconvened for the handover. Nolan arrived with Marcus and 2 department heads, smiling as though the company had already become lighter without me. The handover table held everything I had requested. Current raw material counts, open production orders, machine maintenance status, client deposits tied to unfinished work, approved suppliers, outstanding quality claims, no projections, only what physically existed before Nolan took control. He flipped through the binder. This is excessive. It is complete. Marcus glanced at the inventory pages. Some of these numbers will move immediately once the new procurement plan starts. That is why they are dated. Nolan leaned back. You're trying to create a record that makes every change look like my fault. No, I'm creating a record of what you are receiving. The board chair looked between us. Rachel, are you withdrawing from daily operations completely? Yes. Nolan's smile returned. Finally. I turned to the secretary. Please note that after noon today, I will not approve purchase orders, supplier substitutions, production schedule changes, or client delivery commitments. Marcus frowned. That could create bottlenecks. Only if someone still expects me to make decisions without authority. Nolan closed the binder. I asked for control because Cedar Row needs faster leadership, not because I want you erased. Then you should have no problem leading it. I removed my company access card and placed it beside the transfer packet. Then I signed the resignation from day-to-day management. Nolan stared at the card. You're giving up plant access too? Executive access. What if I need your supplier contacts? You have procurement. What if a hotel client calls you directly? I'll refer them to the CEO. His expression tightened. In my first life, he had wanted authority while keeping my relationships, judgment, and ability to rescue him. This time, I was giving him exactly what he had demanded. Nothing more. Before noon, I asked Lena Ortiz to confirm the physical inventory one final time. She signed beside the counts she had personally verified. At 11:58, I handed the board secretary a sealed envelope. Nolan laughed softly. What is that supposed to be? A handover note. Then give it to me. It isn't addressed to you. I wrote across the front. To be opened at the first independent operational audit following transfer of control. Marcus looked annoyed. What are you expecting them to find? Whatever exists when they look. At noon, the secretary recorded the transfer as effective. Nolan stood and buttoned his jacket. Rachel, you're going to regret walking away from your own company. I picked up my bag. No, I regretted staying after responsibility, stopped matching authority. Then I left while he was still smiling. By 1 o'clock, Nolan was CEO. By 3 that afternoon, he approved the first order I had already warned the plant could not deliver on time. I did not call him. I did not call the client. For the first time, the consequence remained exactly where it had been created. Nolan called me before dinner. The Halcyon order needs to move forward. I saw. The plant says they can't meet the date. They told you that before you signed it. He went quiet. In my first life, that silence had been my cue to start solving the problem. Call suppliers, move crews, negotiate a partial delivery, take responsibility for a promise I had never made. This time, I waited. Finally, he said, Rachel, I need the number for Graham Timber. It's in the approved supplier directory. He won't prioritize Marcus. Then Marcus can build the relationship. You know Graham trusts you. That trust isn't part of the CEO transfer. Nolan hung up. An hour later, I returned to the house we shared. He was still at Cedar Row. I packed 2 suitcases. Not because the marriage was legally over, because I knew exactly what would happen if I stayed. Every night, he would bring home another emergency. Every morning, I would wake up inside his decisions. I left my house key on the kitchen island and moved into the apartment above Cedar Row's original prototype workshop. The building no longer belonged to daily operations. It held old samples, design archives, and the first workbench I had ever bought. For the first time in years, nothing there needed rescuing before morning. At 9:14 p.m., Nolan texted, "You're seriously leaving because I got the job you said I could have?" I answered once. "I'm leaving because you wanted authority and still expected me to carry the consequences." Then I muted the conversation. The next morning, Lena Ortiz called. "You're really not coming in?" "No," she exhaled. "Then I need to tell you something before I stop involving you." I sat down. Nolan approved a new supplier yesterday. Northcrest Sourcing. The name meant nothing to me in this life, but I remembered it from the one I had already lived. When is the first shipment? Friday. What are they supplying? White oak for Halcyon. I looked at the handover copy on my desk, The approved material for that project was Appalachian maple. Nolan had changed the supplier, then the material, less than 24 hours after taking control. And this time, my name was nowhere near the decision. I did not call Nolan about the maple. That was harder than leaving the office. Halcyon was one of Cedar Row's oldest hotel clients. Their design package specified maple because the finish had been approved months earlier. Changing the wood meant new samples, new testing, possibly new approval. In my first life, I had solved that problem before the client ever knew it existed. This time, I opened my handover copy and wrote one note for myself. Halcyon material at transfer, Appalachian maple. No approved substitution. Then I closed the binder. Lena called again Friday morning. The Northcrest shipment arrived. And? Some boards are oak. Some aren't labeled clearly. Moisture readings are inconsistent. What did Nolan say? Use what passes. I stared at the prototype bench in front of me. What did you say? That production won't sign off on material we can't verify. A small part of me wanted to drive straight to the plant. I knew which racks to inspect, which samples to cut, which supplier representative to call. That instinct had destroyed the separation I fought to create in my first life. So I stayed where I was. Follow your normal process, I said. Document what you receive and what you reject. You're really not coming? No. After the call, I began rebuilding something I had neglected for years. My own life. I reopened the prototype workshop 3 days a week and invited 2 junior designers to use the space for testing concepts that were too early for production. No sales promises, no delivery dates, just measurements, samples, and things that had to exist before anyone could sell them. At Cedar Row, Nolan moved faster. Marcus reduced purchases from 2 long-term suppliers and shifted more volume to Northcrest. The spreadsheets looked excellent. Material costs dropped. Projected margins improved. Nolan sent the board an update calling the transition proof that legacy purchasing had been inefficient. Then Lena sent me a photograph, not company records. A picture of the loading bay floor. Stacks of rejected boards sat beneath red tags. How much? I asked. Almost a third of the first shipment. That number had been much lower at this point in my first life. The timeline was already different. Without me negotiating emergency replacements, Northcrest's problems were becoming visible immediately. A week later, the Halcyon project missed its internal production milestone. Nolan called. Tell Lena to release the usable oak. I don't manage Lena. She listens to you. She works for you. He exhaled. You know what happens if Halcyon walks? Yes. And you're comfortable letting that happen? You signed the substitution. Because your supplier system was too expensive. Then your cheaper system needs to deliver. He went silent. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then another memory surfaced. In my first life, Marcus had told me Northcrest was temporary. A bridge supplier, something we would stop using once expansion stabilized. We never did. I opened my old calendar notes. 3 months from now, Northcrest would become Cedar Row's largest external vendor. But there was one difference. In the life I remembered, that transition had taken nearly a year. Nolan had compressed it into weeks. That afternoon, the board secretary called. Nolan requested the first independent operational audit be delayed. I looked at the sealed envelope receipt on my desk. Reason? He says the transition is moving too quickly for the original review date to be meaningful. I smiled without intending to. The audit was still 2 months away, and Nolan already wanted more time before anyone looked closely. For the next month, Nolan looked exactly like the CEO he had always believed he should be. Cedar Row announced 2 new hotel contracts and a restaurant chain expansion. Marcus presented lower material costs and stronger projected margins. The board congratulated Nolan for making decisions without founder hesitation. One business magazine even ran his photograph beneath the headline, "Cedar Row's Next Chapter." I read it from the prototype workshop and went back to sanding a chair leg. Nolan sent me the article himself. Thought you'd appreciate seeing what happens when we stop being afraid to grow. I saved the message and answered nothing. At Cedar Row, Northcrest became the preferred supplier for 3 major product lines. Nolan shortened delivery promises. Sales loved him. Marcus's reports showed more completed work every week. For a while, it looked as though I had been wrong about everything. Then Halcyon rejected the first room sample. Their designer did not care that oak was cheaper. They had approved maple. The entire batch had to be remade before installation. Nolan called it a communication problem. The second crack appeared in the warehouse. A Northcrest invoice listed 18 bundles of white oak delivered. Lena's receiving team counted 14. Marcus said the remaining bundles had probably been unloaded at the second plant. The second plant had no record of them. No one accused anyone. The discrepancy simply remained open. Then came the production report. Marcus told the board that the Westbrook restaurant order was 92% complete. Lena walked the floor that afternoon. More than 40 table bases still had no finished tops. She emailed photographs to Nolan and finance. His answer was brief. Completion percentage reflects committed production, not only assembled units. Lena forwarded the message to me without comment. I did not respond. Those were Nolan's numbers now. His definitions, his promises. And for the first time, nobody was standing behind them quietly turning committed into finished before the client arrived. At the end of the month, Nolan hosted a champagne reception for senior staff. Marcus raised a glass to finally running Cedar Row like a growth company. Everyone applauded. Then Lena received a call from Westbrook. Their installation crew had arrived 2 days early. They were expecting finished furniture. The trucks Cedar Row had promised them were still empty. 2 days after the Westbrook failure, the board secretary called me. Nolan says Northcrest was already under consideration before the transfer. It wasn't approved. He says you knew about the expansion strategy. I knew he wanted cheaper suppliers. Northcrest was not on my approved list. Can you confirm that in writing? I did. Then she sent me the vendor summary Nolan had attached to his response. I opened it, expecting bad purchasing. What I found was something else. Northcrest charged Cedar Row for imported hardware, unfinished components, and raw lumber. Cedar Row paid the freight. Cedar Row paid the plant labor. Cedar Row absorbed rejected material and warranty replacements. But several invoices contained a second delivery instruction. Finished sample packages were being sent to an office in downtown Riverton. The address looked familiar. I searched my email. 3 weeks earlier, one of our oldest hotel clients had forwarded me a presentation Nolan sent after I left operations. I had ignored it because I no longer handled sales. Now I opened it. The proposal came from a company called Bennett Vale Hospitality Projects. Nolan Bennett, Marcus Vale. Same downtown address. The presentation described Cedar Row as the manufacturing partner. Bennett Vale would provide procurement, design coordination, and project management. The client would pay Bennett Vale for the full package. Cedar Row would receive a manufacturing fee. I read the numbers again. In my first life, I had thought Northcrest was simply where money disappeared. Now I understood the structure. Northcrest sold materials into Cedar Row. Cedar Row carried the factory cost, rejected stock, labor, delivery pressure, and warranty risk. Then Nolan's new venture could stand between Cedar Row and the client and collect the higher margin project revenue. If the job went well, Bennett Vale looked profitable. If the material failed, Cedar Row absorbed the damage. Lena called while I was still staring at the proposal. Westbrook wants to know why Nolan offered their next locations through another company. That closed the last gap. He already approached them? Apparently Marcus called it a new partnership model. I looked at the handover binder. At noon on transfer day, Bennett Vale had not been a Cedar Row client, supplier, partner, or approved intermediary. Northcrest had not been approved. None of this belonged to the company I handed Nolan. He had created it afterward. In my first life, I kept Cedar Row strong enough for him to hide what he was doing. This time, without me absorbing the losses, he was making the separation visible much faster. But letting Nolan fail was no longer enough. If he moved Cedar Row's best customers before the company weakened completely, hundreds of employees could lose the business while he kept the relationships. I called the board secretary back. Do not delay the audit. She paused. Rachel, are you accusing Nolan of something? Not yet. I looked at the sealed envelope receipt. I'm asking you to compare what Cedar Row owned on the day I left with where its value is going now. For the first time since my rebirth, I was no longer waiting for Nolan to prove he could not run my company. I needed to stop him from emptying the parts worth saving. The audit stayed on the calendar. That was when Nolan stopped sounding confident. His first call came the next morning. Did you tell the board about Bennett Vale? They asked whether Northcrest existed before the transfer. I answered. You're making a normal partnership look suspicious. I didn't create the partnership. You know exactly how boards react when a founder starts asking questions. I'm not the CEO. He hated hearing that now. 2 months earlier, it had been everything he wanted. At Cedar Row, the problems stopped arriving one at a time. Halcyon demanded replacement samples before approving another room. Westbrook suspended its next 2 locations. A resort client refused to sign a new project through Bennett Vale until Cedar Row explained who would actually manufacture and warranty the furniture. Northcrest continued sending cheaper material. Lena continued rejecting what failed inspection. Marcus responded by accusing production of protecting outdated standards. Lena sent him photographs of split boards and warped panels. You can call the standards old, she told him. The wood is still bent. Meanwhile, I spent my mornings in the prototype workshop. The 2 junior designers had finished their first dining chair. It had taken 3 failed joints and 4 weeks longer than they expected. When one of them apologized, I laughed. This is what prototypes are for. Nothing was sold before it worked. That rule felt almost luxurious. Then Graham from my old timber supplier called. "Nolan wants priority allocation again." "What did you tell him?" "That Cedar Row cancelled most of its standing volume with us." I stayed quiet. "He said you'd confirm it was temporary." "I won't." Graham sighed. "I figured." That afternoon, Nolan came to the workshop himself. He stood among unfinished samples, as though the room offended him. "You really plan to sit here building chairs while Cedar Row burns?" "I'm testing products. You own the company, and you run it." His voice rose. "You know our suppliers. You know the clients. One phone call from you could stabilize this." There it was. Not recognition of what I had built. Recognition of what he could no longer use. "You wanted a company that didn't depend on me. I wanted you to stop controlling everything. And now I have." He paced once across the workshop. "Marcus says the audit will misunderstand the North Crest structure." "Then explain it." "You know it was part of the growth strategy." "No, I know you discussed cheaper purchasing. That is not the same thing." He looked at me for a long moment. Then his voice softened. "Rachel, if Cedar Row loses these accounts, employees get hurt." That almost worked. In my first life, employees had been the reason I surrendered every boundary. This time, I answered carefully. "Then stop moving clients through Bennett Vale." His face closed. So that was the line he would not cross. He did not want Cedar Row saved badly enough to give up the structure benefiting him. 2 days later, Marcus resigned from the Internal Audit Preparation Committee, claiming the review had become hostile. The board requested direct access to procurement records. Lena reported that rejected Northcrest inventory now filled 2 storage areas. And Nolan finally sent me the message I had been waiting for without realizing it. "We need to discuss the handover envelope before they open it." I read the sentence twice. For months, he had laughed at that sealed letter. Now he was afraid of a document he had never seen. The audit meeting began at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. The board sat on one side of the conference table. Plant leadership, finance, procurement, and sales filled the other. Nolan sat beside Marcus. I sat near the door. The auditor spoke first. "We found material differences between reported completion, physical inventory, vendor receipts, and customer delivery status." Nolan folded his hands. "Rapid growth creates timing differences." The auditor continued. "Then we need a reliable starting point." The board secretary reached into the file cabinet and removed my sealed envelope. For the first time, Nolan did not look at me. He looked at the seal. The secretary opened it. Inside were the handover inventory, approved supplier list, machine status, unfinished orders, client deposits, and production conditions recorded before noon on transfer day. At the bottom was my signed statement. "Anything that changes after this date belongs to the management team that chooses to change it." Marcus leaned forward. "This proves nothing about intent." "I never said it did," I replied. I opened the handover binder. At noon on March 15th, Northcrest was not an approved supplier. Bennett Vale was not a Cedar Row partner. Halcyon required maple. Westbrook had no completed inventory recorded beyond what physically existed on the floor. The auditor placed later records beside mine. After the transfer, Northcrest invoices increased sharply. Rejected material increased with them. Orders were reported as substantially complete, while unfinished furniture remained in production. Customer proposals began routing projects through Bennett Vale. Nolan interrupted. That was a strategic expansion model. Then why did Cedar Row carry the production cost while Bennett Vale collected project management revenue? Marcus answered instead. Because Cedar Row was the manufacturing arm. Lena looked across the table. No one at the plants approved becoming someone else's manufacturing arm. Silence followed. Then the auditor presented the warehouse reconciliation. Material billed as delivered could not be matched fully to physical stock. Nolan looked at Marcus looked down. I placed one final page on the table. My resignation from operations. Effective noon, March 15th. No North Crest order carries my approval after that time. No Bennett Vale arrangement carries my authorization. No production estimate after transfer was mine. Nolan finally turned toward me. You knew this would happen. No. I shook my head. I knew what existed when I left. That was the difference. I had not predicted his choices. I had only stopped allowing him to bury them beneath mine. By the time the meeting ended, the board had suspended Nolan's executive authority and ordered a full review of North Crest and Bennett Vale. The sealed letter had not destroyed him. Everything he did after I sealed it had. Nolan found me outside the boardroom after everyone else had left. For once, he had no presentation in his hand, no numbers, no Marcus beside him. Rachel, we can still contain this. I looked at him. How? Tell the board. North Crest was part of the transition strategy. Say Bennett Vale was something we discussed before you stepped away. We didn't. You knew I wanted expansion. That is not the same thing. His voice dropped. If you say we planned it together, they'll treat this as a failed strategy instead of misconduct. There it was. Even now, he did not want forgiveness. He wanted shared responsibility. You spent years saying Cedar Row would succeed if I stopped interfering. He looked away. I was angry. No. You wanted ownership of the decisions. He finally met my eyes. And now? Oh, now you have it. For a moment, he looked less like the man who had taken my company, and more like the husband who had once asked me to trust his vision. I never thought you would really leave me alone with it. That hurt more than I expected, because it was true. He had never wanted me gone. He had wanted my authority gone while my labor remained. I picked up my bag. You asked me to step aside. I walked toward the elevator. This is what stepping aside looks like. 1 year later, Cedar Row was still standing. A professional operating team ran the company. I remained an owner, but I never returned to the CEO office. Most mornings, I worked in the prototype shop instead. Wood shavings on the floor, half-built samples on the benches, no projections, pretending to be finished products. One afternoon, a salesperson brought me a new chair design. The client wants delivery 6 weeks earlier. Can I promise it? I looked at the unfinished prototype. One joint still needed testing. The finish had not been approved. I closed the production notebook. Not until it exists. He nodded and walked away. I stayed beside the workbench. For once, nothing needed to be exaggerated to become valuable.